The phone rang at 2:41 a.m., sharp and invasive, slicing through the quiet of the rain-soaked Seattle night. Naomi Carter woke instantly, heart already racing before her mind could catch up. Years of late-night emergency calls, from publishers in different time zones, from graduate students in crisis, from institutions that needed her expertise now, had trained her body to react before thought. She reached for the phone on instinct. Hello? There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then a woman's voice slid through the speaker, low and calm, almost amused. "Dr. Carter," the woman said, "I'm sorry to wake you, but I thought you deserved to know that your husband is asleep in my bed right now." The room seemed to tilt. Naomi sat up, the sheet falling away from her shoulders as the words settled. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of a blade finding its mark. The woman continued, unhurried. "He told me you'd probably be working late, or traveling, something important. You always are, aren't you?" Naomi didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat had closed, as if her body was trying to protect her from what her mind was already assembling. "He's been coming here for months," the woman added, her tones sharpening with satisfaction. "Tuesdays, usually. Sometimes Fridays. He says you don't really notice anymore, that you live in your head, that I make him feel seen." Naomi's fingers tightened around the phone. 8 months, her mind supplied coldly. 8 months of late flights. 8 months of carefully worded excuses. 8 months of trust quietly eroding beneath routine. Then something changed. In the background, Naomi heard a sound she hadn't expected. A man laughing. Not a warm laugh. Not the polished, public laugh Ethan used at conferences and fundraisers. This was low, unguarded, almost entertained. "What are you doing?" the woman snapped suddenly. The confidence in her voice fractured. "Why are you laughing? What do you mean, both of them?" There was the faint sound of fingers sliding across glass. A phone screen. Photos. "Stop. What are those?" the woman whispered. No, that's not." Ethan's laughter deepened. "Oh my God," the woman breathed, the cruelty gone, replaced by something raw and terrified. You didn't tell me I wasn't the only one." The line went dead. Naomi stared at the dark screen of her phone, the silence roaring louder than the rain outside her window. Her pulse thundered in her ears as a single thought cut through the shock with terrifying clarity. The woman hadn't called to hurt her. She'd called to feel powerful. And something had gone so wrong that she ran. If you're already feeling that tight pull in your chest, the sense that this call was only the beginning, take a second right now. Stay with this story. Tap like if you're here for the truth. Leave a comment if you've ever felt blindsided by someone you trusted. And follow along, because what Naomi is about to uncover isn't just betrayal. It's a pattern. And patterns don't stop on their own. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, as Naomi set the phone down with deliberate care. She didn't cry. Not yet. Years of studying human behavior had taught her that shock often arrived before emotion, like a system rebooting after a catastrophic failure. She swung her legs out of bed and stood, the cold floor grounding her. Seattle's skyline glowed faintly beyond the window, glass towers, blinking lights, a city that never fully slept. For the first time in her marriage, Naomi felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not heartbreak, not anger, unease. Ethan Wright was many things. Charming, calculated, brilliant in rooms full of powerful people. He was not careless. He did not laugh like that unless he was certain of his position, and that terrified her more than the affair ever could. Naomi walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water she didn't drink. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window. A black woman in her early 40s, composed even now, her face giving nothing away. A woman whose career was built on recognizing patterns others missed. She thought of the mistress's final words. "You didn't tell me I wasn't the only one." Naomi realized then that the call wasn't meant to end like that. It was supposed to humiliate her, to reduce her to a punchline in someone else's story. Instead, It had cracked something open. And somewhere in the city, Ethan was laughing, confident, unbothered, certain that the pieces on the board were exactly where he'd left them. What he didn't know, as Naomi stood alone in the quiet aftermath of that call, was that the game had already shifted, and the woman he thought he understood had just begun to pay attention. By morning, the city had rearranged itself into something familiar again. Traffic hissed along wet pavement, coffee shops filled with a low murmur of conversations that mattered urgently to the people having them, and not at all to anyone else. Seattle, efficient and indifferent, carried on. Naomi Carter did the same. She stood beneath the shower longer than usual, letting the heat steady her breathing, rehearsing the small rituals of normalcy. Shampoo, conditioner, the robe hanging exactly where she'd left it, the mirror fogged, then cleared, revealing a woman who looked composed, alert, unbroken. That woman had learned long ago that panic was a luxury. Clarity was survival. Naomi wasn't famous in the way celebrities were famous, but in certain circles, academic, political, corporate, her name carried weight. Behavioral economist, professor, consultant, she built models that explained why people trusted when they shouldn't, stayed when they should leave, complied when resistance would save them. Governments had paid for her insights. Tech companies had quietly adjusted algorithms based on her work. She was invited into rooms where decisions were made and consequences outsourced. She understood human behavior not as theory, but as pattern, which was why the phone call unsettled her so deeply. In her office at the university, sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating shelves lined with books she had underlined, challenged, argued with. On her desk lay a draft of a paper she'd been revising for months. Asymmetric information and emotional leverage in intimate partnerships. The title felt suddenly accusatory. Naomi sat down slowly. The mistress's voice replayed in her mind, but not the taunts. It was the moment the woman's confidence collapsed that stayed with her. Fear, genuine and unfiltered, had a texture Naomi recognized instantly. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't jealousy. It was the fear of realizing you had misunderstood the rules of the game. Ethan had always been careful with rules. That was one of the things people admired about him. Venture capital had rewarded his restraint, his patience, his refusal to rush outcomes. He didn't chase, he positioned, he waited. He liked to say that most people failed not because they were stupid, but because they assumed fairness where there was none. At dinner parties, people leaned in when he spoke. When he disagreed, he did it gently, almost kindly, as if offering a correction rather than a challenge. Naomi had once thought that was humility. Now she wasn't so sure. She thought back to the early days of their marriage, how attentive he'd been, how interested in her work. He'd read her papers, really read them, and asked questions that made her pause, impressed. He'd told her he admired her mind, her independence, the way she didn't need reassurance the way other women did. At the time, it had felt like recognition. Now she wondered if it had been assessment. Naomi opened her calendar and scrolled backward. Trips, conferences, consulting engagements. Ethan's schedule aligned with hers with unsettling precision. When she traveled, he traveled. When she stayed late, he had meetings. When she was exhausted, he was patient. Too patient, her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Running late today. Dinner without me. Love you. The words sat there, neat and harmless. No urgency, no guilt, just expectation. Naomi locked her phone and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She felt the slow, creeping discomfort that came when a hypothesis formed against one's will. In her professional life, this was the moment she trusted most, the uneasy sense that something elegant and terrible was beginning to explain too much. If Ethan had been simply careless, the mistress would have stayed cruel. She hadn't, which meant whatever Ethan had shown her wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to establish hierarchy, to remind the woman, any woman, that she was replaceable, comparable, measurable. Naomi's chest tightened. In her lectures, She often told students that manipulation didn't begin with lies. It began with framing, with deciding who had access to the full picture and who would forever see only fragments. Power lived in that imbalance. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. For the first time, Naomi allowed herself to consider the possibility that she hadn't married a man who broke the rules. She had married a man who designed them. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the windows. Naomi opened her laptop, not to search, not to accuse, but to observe, to note timelines, to record impressions, to do what she had always done best when uncertainty threatened to overwhelm reason. She began to pay attention, and attention, she knew, was never passive. It was the first step toward understanding. And understanding, true understanding, had consequences. Naomi had always trusted patterns more than promises. Promises were emotional. Patterns were empirical. By the third day after the call, she stopped trying to convince herself that life had returned to normal. Normal was an illusion sustained by repetition, and repetition was exactly what now felt wrong. It began with small things, details so minor they would have escaped anyone not trained to notice drift. Ethan had still locking his phone at night. Not obviously, not defensively, just a subtle change in muscle memory, the screen turning dark a second faster than before. He had also stopped leaving it face up on the kitchen counter while he showered, a habit he'd never consciously cultivated but had practiced for years. Naomi noticed because habits, once formed, rarely vanished without cause. She noticed the way his stories shortened. Where he once filled space with context, who said what, who reacted how, he now delivered clean summaries, stripped of texture, efficient, sanitized, and she noticed the compliments. They had shifted. "You're brilliant" had become, "You're so disciplined." "I admire how deeply you think" had become, "I respect your focus." The words were still positive, but flatter, less personal, as if he were praising a system rather than a person. At night, when Ethan slept beside her, Naomi lay awake listening to his breathing, cataloging its rhythm the way she once had with their newborn nephew during a long hospital vigil. Even unconscious, Ethan was controlled. His body relaxed but never surrendered. She remembered a lecture she'd given years ago on predictive asymmetry, the advantage gained by the person who knows more about how the other will behave under pressure. At the time, she'd illustrated the concept with financial markets and political campaigns. She hadn't mentioned marriage. Naomi began reconstructing timelines, not obsessively, methodically. She pulled up emails, calendars, travel receipts, not to accuse but to compare. What she found wasn't a smoking gun. It was something more unsettled. Alignment. Her busiest periods matched his absences almost perfectly. When she traveled for conferences, he scheduled offsites. When she entered weeks of grant deadlines and late nights, he volunteered for panels, dinners, networking events that conveniently ended after midnight. It was elegant, clean, almost beautiful in its symmetry. And suddenly, she understood something that made her stomach tighten. This wasn't chaos. It was design. Naomi remembered a dinner party from the year before. A woman, sharp, well-dressed, confident, had spoken animatedly about a startup she was building. Ethan had listened with focused attention, asking thoughtful questions, encouraging her to elaborate. Naomi had admired his engagement, even teased him later about recruiting talent outside of work hours. At the time, he'd smiled and said, "I just like understanding how people think." Now Naomi wondered what he'd taken from that conversation. She remembered another moment, quieter. Ethan had once asked her, almost casually, how she handled conflict with close colleagues. Naomi had answered honestly. She preferred calm discussion, data, time. She didn't escalate unless she had to. He nodded thoughtfully, as if filing it away. That memory made her breath catch. Naomi stopped telling herself she was being paranoid when she noticed Ethan's questions had become more specific. How long did it take for courts to freeze assets in high-net-worth divorces? What constituted admissible digital evidence across state lines? Why did so many women hesitate to pursue aggressive legal action even when wronged? She had answered him then, assuming curiosity. Now she heard calculation. The phone call returned to her again and again. Not the betrayal, but the terror. The moment the mistress realized she wasn't special, wasn't chosen, wasn't even primary. Naomi recognized that terror because she taught it. It was the moment a subject realized they were inside an experiment. That realization altered everything. By the end of the week, Naomi accepted what she could no longer deny. The man she lived with was not improvising. He was executing. And whatever role she occupied in his life, it had been defined long before she was aware of it. That knowledge did not make her panic. It made her still. In stillness, patterns sharpened. Naomi stopped confronting inconsistencies. She stopped correcting minor lies. She began responding with neutrality, with curiosity, with the same attentive listening she used in high-stakes negotiations. Ethan relaxed in response, mistaking her quiet for ignorance. That was his mistake. Because Naomi Carter knew something Ethan had failed to account for. Patterns don't just reveal intent. They reveal endings. And once you see an ending coming, you can decide whether to walk toward it blindly or reshape it entirely. Naomi chose to reshape. And somewhere beneath Ethan's careful composure, beneath the rules he believed he controlled, the first fracture had already formed. The email arrived at 11:18 p.m., slipping into Naomi's inbox without urgency, without subject line fanfare, just a single word in the header. "I'm sorry." Naomi stared at it for a long moment before opening it, aware of the strange calm that had settled over her in recent days. Shock had burned itself out. What remained was readiness. Inside the email was no explanation, no confession, no attempt at justification. There was a link. Naomi copied it into a secure browser, heart steady, mind alert. The page that loaded was plain, no branding, no personalization, just a shared cloud folder with viewing access enabled. The timestamp showed it had been created less than an hour earlier. The first thing Naomi noticed was the naming convention. Each folder was labeled with a woman's first name and a date range. Some spanned weeks, others months. A few stretched across years. Naomi clicked one at random. Inside were screenshots of text conversations, intimate, flirtatious, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Photos followed. Not explicit at first. Dinners, hotel rooms, smiling faces captured mid-laugh. Then others, taken without awareness. A woman asleep, light from a window tracing her cheek. Another brushing her hair, unaware she was being watched. Naomi exited the folder and scrolled. There were dozens, and then she saw it. A subfolder labeled Comparative Notes. Her breath caught. This wasn't a collection born of sentiment or obsession. It was organized, structured, clinical. Inside were documents, tables, annotations, behavioral observations, notes on emotional responses, compliance, resistance, attachment curves mapped against time. Naomi understood immediately. These women hadn't been lovers. They had been variables. Her gaze moved to the final folder at the bottom of the list. It wasn't alphabetized. It had been added recently. The name on it was hers. Naomi didn't open it. Not yet. She scrolled back to the top and noticed something else the mistress must have seen. Something that explained the terror in her voice. Another file, separate from the names. Redundancy. Naomi opened it. Inside were side-by-side comparisons. Messages sent on the same night to different women, altered only slightly. Compliments reused. Conflicts anticipated and preempted. Emotional milestones scheduled with unnerving precision. There it was, the answer to the question that had haunted Naomi since the call. The mistress hadn't discovered she was cheating with a married man. She had discovered she was replaceable by design. Naomi closed her eyes, absorbing the full weight of it. The humiliation the woman must have felt when she realized she wasn't chosen, wasn't unique, wasn't even preferred, just effective. The email refreshed. A second message appeared beneath the first. "He sent me that folder by mistake," the mistress wrote. "He meant to show me something else. He laughed when I started asking questions. He said I should feel honored to be included." Naomi's jaw tightened. Included. The mistress continued. "I thought I was special. Then I saw how many of us there were, how organized it was, how calm he was about it." A pause, marked by a blank line. "I don't think he sees us as people." Naomi finally opened the folder with her name. Inside were fewer photos than she'd expected. But what was there felt more invasive than quantity ever could be. Images of her working late in her home office, asleep on the couch with a book open on her chest, standing at the bathroom mirror, towel wrapped around her body, unaware she was being observed. There were documents, too. Notes on her habits, her stress responses, her conflict avoidance tendencies, her thresholds. At the bottom of the folder was a single text file, long-term outcome projection. Naomi didn't open it. She didn't need to. She understood now what the mistress had seen, why her voice had cracked, why the cruelty had evaporated into fear. The woman had glimpsed the truth Naomi was only now fully facing. Ethan Wright did not fall in love. He studied, and he didn't stop when the subject was aware. Naomi closed the browser and leaned back in her chair, the hum of the house surrounding her. Somewhere upstairs, Ethan moved, the sound of his footsteps faint and unremarkable. The same man who kissed her goodbye in the mornings, who praised her discipline, who spoke about ethics and long-term value. For the first time, Naomi felt something sharper than fear. Recognition. The call hadn't ended the way the mistress intended. The email hadn't either. Both had done something far more dangerous. They had given Naomi sight. And once you truly see a pattern like this, you can no longer pretend it's accidental. You can only decide what to do with it. Naomi opened a new document on her computer and titled it with quiet precision, Observations. Then she began to write. Naomi waited until the house was asleep. Not quiet, asleep. There was a difference. Silence could be deceptive. Sleep was surrender. Ethan's breathing had settled into its familiar cadence, slow and controlled, even in rest, as if his body refused to relinquish command. Naomi lay beside him for several minutes longer, eyes open in the dark, counting the seconds between breaths until certainty replaced doubt. Then she moved. She slipped from the bed without sound, pulling the door closed with the same care she used when leaving a lecture hall after a difficult question. Unhurried, precise, leaving no trace of disturbance behind her. Downstairs, the glow of the kitchen light reflected off steel and glass, the house revealing itself as it always did, immaculate, intentional, curated to suggest transparency. Naomi sat at the dining table and opened her laptop. She did not rush. Rushing created mistakes, and mistakes created narratives she could not afford. Instead, she reviewed what she already knew. The cloud folder the mistress had shared was real. The metadata checked out. The access permissions confirmed it hadn't been fabricated. And crucially, Ethan had linked the account to a shared financial login years ago, back when trust had still been mutual and unquestioned. She logged in. The archive loaded slowly, as if reluctant to reveal itself all at once. What emerged was not chaos, not obsession, not even cruelty in the way Naomi had expected. It was order. Meticulous, chilling order. The kind that suggested long-term intent rather than impulse. There were folders nested within folders, hierarchies mapped with the same clarity Ethan used when evaluating investments. Each woman was cataloged not only by name, but by category: professional risk, emotional volatility, asset exposure. Naomi's hands stilled on the keyboard. This wasn't personal. It was strategic. She opened a folder labeled Methodology. Inside were documents that made her stomach turn, not because they were graphic, but because they were familiar. Ethan had borrowed language from her world, from behavioral economics, from social psychology. Terms like reinforcement cycles, trust erosion thresholds, dependency acceleration. He had been studying her work. No, He had been weaponizing it. Audio files followed, short clips, carefully edited, conversations stripped of context, preserved only for tone and response, laughter, tears, confessions, moments of vulnerability captured and indexed, tagged with notes like high compliance after reassurance or resistance decreases under fatigue. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself. This was not infidelity. It was research without consent. She scrolled further. Financial documents appeared next. Transfers routed through shell accounts. Investments shifted shortly before separations. Debts quietly assumed, then strategically abandoned. Patterns emerged so cleanly that Naomi felt a grim, professional recognition. He had done this before. He would do it again. At the bottom of the directory, one final folder stood apart. Not hidden, not encrypted, just waiting. Contingencies. Naomi opened it. Inside were draft timelines, legal outlines, scripts for difficult conversations, even predicted emotional responses, scored by likelihood. Her name appeared repeatedly, paired with phrases like career prioritization narrative and public perception management. He had already planned how she would be blamed. Naomi leaned back, the weight of the archive settling into her bones. Somewhere above her, Ethan shifted in his sleep, unaware that the carefully constructed distance between what he did and what could be proven had just collapsed. She understood now why the mistress had panicked, why she had gone silent mid-call. The woman had seen this, the scope, the coldness, the inevitability. She had realized she was standing at the edge of something much larger than betrayal. Naomi closed the laptop without logging out. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened screen. Composed, alert, changed. The woman looking back was no longer searching for reassurance or explanations. She was calculating risk. And for the first time since the call, Naomi felt something settle deep in her chest. Not fear, not even anger. Resolve. Archives existed for one reason, so that nothing was forgotten. Ethan had built his to preserve control. Naomi would use it to dismantle him. The name appeared in the archive so quietly that Naomi almost missed it. Not in the main directories, not in the polished timelines or comparative tables. It sat alone in an older folder, dated more than a decade back, formatted differently from the rest, as if it belonged to an earlier version of Ethan, one less refined but no less deliberate. Lena Wright, marriage, 2009 to 2013. Naomi stared at the name longer than she meant to. Ethan had mentioned a first marriage once, years ago, in passing, a college relationship. It just didn't work, he'd said, with the practiced neutrality he applied to anything inconvenient. No drama, no bitterness, just an incompatibility between two young people who wanted different things. Naomi had believed him. She opened the folder. It was thinner than the others. No photos, no audio files, just documents, court records, settlement summaries, credit reports marked confidential, and one scanned article from a local paper in Ohio, the print grainy and uneven, as if copied hastily. Local bakery closes after owner declares bankruptcy. Naomi's pulse slowed as she read. Lena had owned the bakery. She'd opened it with her own savings, built it over 7 years, employed 8 people at its peak. The article mentioned a sudden loss of capital, a failed expansion, personal debts she couldn't recover from. No mention of Ethan. No explanation that made sense. Naomi scrolled. There were notes attached. Ethan's notes. Subject demonstrates high trust baseline. Responds positively to shared financial planning. Risk tolerance increases when framed as our future. Naomi's throat tightened. This wasn't retrospective analysis. It had been written during the marriage. She dug deeper, cross-referencing public records the way she taught her graduate students to do. What emerged was devastating in its simplicity. Loans co-signed, then transferred. Business accounts entangled with personal ones. Quiet withdrawals that escalated just before the divorce filing. Lena hadn't disappeared. She had been erased. Naomi found her online only after several attempts. No professional profile, No recent photos, just a phone number attached to a modest apartment listing in a Cleveland suburb. Naomi hesitated before calling. This was no longer research. This was intrusion. But she knew something else now too. Silence was part of the design. Isolation was the final step. The line rang 4 times. Hello? A woman's voice answered, cautious, older than Naomi expected. My name is Naomi Carter, Naomi said gently. I'm calling about Ethan Wright. The pause on the other end stretched, heavy and unmistakable. I don't talk about him, the woman said finally. I understand, Naomi replied. I wouldn't have called if it weren't important. Another pause, then quieter. Is he married again? Yes. The exhale that followed sounded like grief long held in. They spoke for nearly an hour. Lena didn't cry. She didn't rant. She spoke with the flat calm of someone who had learned that emotion changed nothing. She described the early charm, the shared dreams, the way Ethan had taken over to help, the way problems appeared suddenly, as if conjured, the way everyone, including her own family, had begun to see her as unstable, irresponsible, bad with money. He kept records, Lena said at one point, of everything I said when I was upset. He'd bring it up later, calmly, like evidence. Naomi closed her eyes. Lena laughed softly, humorless. When I lost the bakery, people stopped calling. I thought it was my fault. For years, Naomi felt something shift inside her then. Not outrage, not pity, recognition. When the call ended, Naomi sat motionless at her desk, the rain tapping against the window like a metronome, marking time she could never give back. Ethan hadn't just destroyed marriages. He had rewritten women's lives and walked away untouched. But Lena had survived, quietly, invisibly. Naomi reopened the archive and created a new folder. She named it Witnesses. Lena Wright was the first file inside. She would not be the last. Knowledge did not arrive gently. It settled into Naomi's body like a second pulse, quiet, constant, impossible to ignore. Once she had seen the shape of Ethan's past, she could no longer move through her days untouched by it. Every familiar routine now carried a shadow. Every shared moment came with an unspoken calculation. At breakfast, Ethan poured her coffee the way he always had. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, mug warmed first with hot water. The care in the gesture was flawless. Naomi accepted the cup with a soft thank you, her smile practiced enough to pass, while something inside her recoiled at the precision. Care, she was learning, could be a tool. At work, she lectured on decision fatigue and emotional coercion, her voice steady, her arguments sharp. Students leaned forward, scribbling notes as she explained how prolonged stress reduced resistance, how trust could be engineered over time. Naomi heard herself speaking with an authority that bordered on cruelty. She wondered how many people in that room would recognize themselves in her examples. At night, the cost sharpened. Ethan's touch, once grounding, familiar, now felt invasive. Each kiss landed with the weight of context. Each whispered endearment arrived pre-labeled in her mind. Reinforcement, attachment maintenance, behavioral reset. She let none of it show. That was the most exhausting part. Not fear, not rage, but restraint. Naomi was living inside a study she could not yet publish, collecting data in real time while pretending the outcome was uncertain. Sleep became shallow. She dreamed in fragments, voices overlapping, folders opening endlessly, women standing in doorways with faces she couldn't quite see. She woke with her jaw clenched, her body braced as if for impact. Once, in the quiet hours before dawn, she stood in the bathroom staring at her reflection, searching for signs she had missed. Was there a moment when she had known and turned away? A time when discomfort had been easier than truth? The answer unsettled her. There had been moments, small ones, doubts dismissed as overthinking, instincts overridden by evidence Ethan himself had curated. Naomi had trusted not because she was naive, but because trust aligned with the person she believed herself to be. That realization hurt more than betrayal. It forced her to confront a question she had never had to ask before. How much of her certainty had been earned, and how much had been gently guided? She sought therapy, not as confession, but as maintenance. A place where she could say his name out loud without strategizing, without editing. The therapist listened carefully, asking questions Naomi recognized as diagnostic rather than comforting. "Why haven't you confronted him?" the woman asked. "Because knowing isn't the same as being ready," Naomi replied. That was the truth. Confrontation would collapse the system, and Naomi needed the system intact a little longer. Evidence gathered too soon could be dismissed. Emotion displayed too early could be reframed. So she paid the cost. She attended dinners, nodded at Ethan's anecdotes, laughed at jokes that now rang hollow. She made love when she had to, dissociating just enough to remain present, telling herself that endurance had always been one of her strengths. But endurance was not infinite. One evening, Ethan mentioned Lena casually over dessert, as if testing a hypothesis. "I was thinking about my first wife the other day," he said. "I wonder sometimes if I could have handled things differently." Naomi felt her heartbeat spike, but her face remained neutral. "People grow," she said carefully. He watched her then, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "Not everyone does." Later, alone in the dark, Naomi allowed herself one moment of unfiltered emotion. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her ribs, breathing through the surge. This was the cost of knowing. The erosion of innocence, the burden of foresight. But even in that moment, she understood something else. Knowledge took away comfort, yes, but it also took away confusion. And confusion had always been Ethan's greatest ally. When Naomi finally lay back down beside him, staring into the dark, she made herself a promise she did not yet know how to keep. She would not let this knowledge destroy her. She would let it prepare her. Because the cost of knowing was high, but the cost of staying blind was higher. Naomi stopped confiding in friends, not because she didn't trust them, but because trust, emotional trust, was no longer what she needed. Sympathy blurred judgment. Outrage rushed decisions. Well-meaning advice often carried an urgency that benefited the wrong person. What Naomi needed now was not comfort. It was precision. She began with a name she had written down weeks earlier and never used. Avery Holt, a forensic accountant known in quiet legal circles for unraveling financial structures designed to look innocuous. Naomi didn't explain everything in their first call. She didn't have to. "I need you to tell me," Naomi said calmly, "what can be proven, what can be reconstructed, and what should never be touched." There was a pause on the other end. Then Holt replied, "You're asking the right question." The meeting took place in an unremarkable office south of downtown, intentionally forgettable. No glass walls, no branding. Holt listened without interruption as Naomi outlined the archive. Not the emotional impact, but the architecture of it. The categories, the timestamps, the shell entities, the pattern of escalation. When she finished, Holt leaned back and folded his hands. "This isn't messy," he said. "That's the problem." He built this assuming no one would ever look at it holistically. Naomi felt a small release in her chest. Validation, not of pain, but of perception. Next came legal counsel. Not the kind who promised vengeance or vindication, but someone who spoke in contingencies and constraints. Marisol Vega, a civil rights attorney with a background in financial abuse cases, listened as Naomi described her marriage as if it were a case study. Vega's questions were surgical. How did you gain access? What accounts are joint? What has he represented publicly versus privately? Has he ever encouraged you to delay legal documentation for the sake of harmony? Yes, often, Vega nodded. That matters. They spoke about admissibility, about consent laws, about the difference between moral certainty and legal leverage. Vega made one thing clear. Exposure without strategy would backfire. Men like Ethan thrived on reframing, on portraying themselves as the wronged party, blindsided by aggression. You don't confront someone like this, Vega said. You contain them. The word settled heavily, but it fit. Finally, Naomi contacted a digital privacy investigator. Not to hack, not to spy, but to understand where the boundaries were and how Ethan had crossed them. What could be traced? What could be corroborated independently? What would stand up when challenged by a defense designed to exhaust rather than refute? By the end of the week, Naomi's dining table had transformed into a quiet command center. No photographs, no dramatic revelations laid out in the open. Just lists, timelines, secure notes. Everything encrypted, backed up, duplicated off-site. And something else had changed. Naomi no longer felt alone. Not because she was surrounded by people, but because she was no longer carrying the weight of interpretation by herself. Each professional saw what she saw. Not betrayal, but structure. Not emotion, but intent. Ethan, meanwhile, grew more relaxed. He mistook Naomi's calm for acceptance, her silence for resignation. When she declined a weekend trip, citing deadlines, he smiled indulgently, as if confirming a theory. He began speaking more openly about stress, about how relationships sometimes ran their course. Naomi listened, always listening. One evening, as he talked about a colleague's divorce, how ugly it had become, how irrational the wife was, Naomi studied the ease with which he narrated another woman's unraveling. That was when she understood the final piece. Ethan did not fear being caught. He feared losing control of the narrative. And narratives were built long before they were revealed. Naomi closed her notebook that night with a sense of clarity that felt almost serene. Emotional advice would have urged her to demand answers, to expose him, to reclaim dignity through confrontation. Professional help had given her something far more dangerous: time, and a strategy that didn't rely on Ethan ever telling the truth. Because the truth, she now understood, was something he believed he owned. Soon, he would learn otherwise. Ethan chose the timing carefully. Naomi recognized it the moment he suggested they talk. Thursday evening, after dinner, when the house would be quiet and the week's momentum already spent. Conversations like this, he knew, landed best when people were tired, when resistance softened under the guise of intimacy. He poured the wine himself, a deliberate choice, control disguised as courtesy. "I've been thinking about us," he said, settling into the chair across from her, his voice low, reflective. "About how long it's been since we really checked in with each other." Naomi nodded, folding her hands loosely in her lap. She let her posture convey openness without vulnerability. She had practiced this in the mirror, not to deceive, but to remain unreadable. "I worry," Ethan continued, "that we've been living parallel lives. You're so committed to your work. I admire that about you, truly. But sometimes I feel like there's no space left for us." There it was, the opening frame. Appreciation wrapped around accusation. Naomi felt a familiar tug in her chest, the reflex to explain, to reassure, to balance his feelings against her own. She let it pass. Instead, she asked softly, "What makes you feel that way?" Ethan smiled, not triumphantly, patiently, as if pleased she was following the script. "We don't talk the way we used to," he said. "When you're home, you're exhausted. When you're traveling, you're unreachable. I don't think you even realize how distant you've become." Distant, not absent, not unfaithful. The word was carefully chosen. It suggested neglect without malice, a flaw rather than a betrayal. Naomi absorbed it without reaction. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I've asked myself whether I'm being unreasonable, whether I'm asking too much. But I don't think wanting emotional connection from your wife is too much." There it was again, the positioning, him as the reasonable one, her as the inadvertent transgressor. Naomi met his eyes. "Are you saying you're unhappy?" Ethan hesitated, a fractional delay that would have escaped most people. He hadn't expected the question so directly. "I'm saying," he replied carefully, "that I'm concerned. About where this is heading if nothing changes. Naomi nodded slowly, as if considering the weight of his concern. Inside, she noted the shift. He was escalating sooner than planned. The archive had suggested he preferred gradual erosion, not confrontation. Something had accelerated him. "Do you want to separate?" she asked. This time, he couldn't hide the surprise. "I want us to be honest," he said, recovering smoothly. "Maybe explore some space, without hostility, without blame, just to see if we can find our way back, or accept that we've grown apart." Space, trial separation, amicable language designed to disarm. Naomi felt the quiet satisfaction of confirmation. He was initiating phase one. She exhaled slowly, letting her shoulders soften. When she spoke, her voice carried a hint of vulnerability, measured, intentional. "If that's what you need," she said, "I won't fight you." Ethan blinked. The silence that followed was brief but charged. This was not the response he had rehearsed against. There was no pleading, no denial, no promise to change. "I don't want to hurt you," he said cautiously. "I know," Naomi replied. And she meant it, not because she believed he cared, but because she understood his priorities. Pain was collateral. Control was the objective. She looked down at her hands, then back up. "I just need time to process this. I'm not ready for lawyers or announcements. Not yet." Relief flickered across his face before he masked it. "Of course, take all the time you need." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was gentle, familiar, convincing. Naomi did not pull away. In that moment, Ethan believed he had succeeded. He believed he had introduced doubt, seeded guilt, secured cooperation. He believed the conversation had gone exactly as planned. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that Naomi had not come to this conversation to decide anything. She had come to confirm. And confirmation, once obtained, changed everything. As they finished their wine in companionable quiet, Ethan relaxed into the certainty of momentum. Naomi mirrored his calm, her expression thoughtful, her silence accommodating. Inside, her mind was already moving ahead. The conversation he thought he controlled had given her exactly what she needed. Proof of intent, proof of timing, proof that he was ready to move. And when someone reveals their next move, the only real advantage left is choosing when to counter. Naomi had already chosen. Ethan had always believed he understood power. Not the crude kind, volume, force, intimidation, but the quieter kind that lived in assumptions. In who was believed without proof, in who was granted patience, in who was expected to endure. That was where he miscalculated Naomi Carter. From the beginning, he had admired her intelligence. He had said so often, publicly and privately. But admiration, Naomi now understood, was not the same as respect. Admiration was passive. It allowed distance. Respect required caution. Ethan had never been cautious with her. He assumed that because Naomi was composed, she would absorb harm silently. Because she was accomplished, she would protect her reputation at all costs. Because she was a Black woman who had climbed carefully through institutions never built for her, she would choose stability over disruption. He assumed resilience meant tolerance. Naomi saw now how often that assumption had been rewarded in his life. Lena had been hardworking, proud of her independence. When things began to unravel, she blamed herself before blaming him. She had worried about appearances, about being seen as bitter, about confirming stereotypes she'd spent her life outrunning. Others had done the same. Different cities, different professions, same outcome. Ethan didn't need to threaten them. He let the world do that for him. He knew how easily a woman's anger could be reframed as instability, how quickly her certainty could be questioned if she spoke too forcefully. And Naomi, calm, analytical, unwilling to perform pain, fit neatly into his expectations. He underestimated her because he mistook self-control for compliance. What Ethan never understood was how much restraint Naomi had learned long before she met him. How many rooms she had entered, already prepared to be underestimated. How often she had survived by listening more than speaking, by mapping dynamics before acting. Her entire career had been built in systems that assumed she would be grateful just to be included. She had learned, instead, to observe. Ethan also believed he had an advantage because he thought Naomi would hesitate to fight publicly, that she would fear being labeled aggressive, calculating, difficult, that she would try to preserve harmony even at personal cost. He was right about one thing. Naomi was calculating. But calculation did not mean cruelty. It meant clarity. It meant knowing when emotion clouded judgment and when it sharpened it. What Ethan failed to account for was that Naomi's discipline was not a weakness. It was a weapon she had refined for decades. She knew how to wait, how to gather consensus, how to move institutions slowly but irreversibly. She also understood something Ethan never had to learn. Survival did not come from domination. It came from adaptation. He believed she would respond like the women before her, privately devastated, publicly restrained, quietly erased. He did not imagine she would document. He did not imagine she would consult. He did not imagine she would outpace him without ever raising her voice. And he never imagined that the very traits he'd quietly cataloged, her patience, her analytical mind, her refusal to act impulsively, would become the foundation of his undoing. Naomi did not need to rage. She only needed to proceed. As she reviewed her notes late that night, cross-referencing timelines and legal thresholds, she felt something close to grief, not for the marriage, but for the version of herself Ethan thought he could predict. That woman had never existed. Ethan had studied patterns in others and mistaken them for universal laws. He had believed power was something you took and stored, like capital. Naomi understood power differently. Power was knowing when someone believed they had already won. And that was the moment Naomi had been waiting for. Because underestimation, she knew, was the most expensive mistake a strategist could make. And Ethan had made it with absolute certainty. Naomi did not sleep the night before she filed, not because she was afraid, but because clarity has its own kind of wakefulness. Once a decision is fully formed, the body no longer negotiates with doubt. It prepares. Dawn arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of light over Seattle's skyline. Naomi stood at the kitchen window, coffee untouched in her hands, watching the city move, as it always did. Somewhere across town, Ethan was likely waking with the quiet confidence of a man who believed momentum was on his side. She let him have the morning. By 9:12 a.m., Naomi was seated in a conference room that smelled faintly of polished wood and toner. Marisol Vega sat across from her, composed, unflinching, a legal pad already filled with neat, decisive handwriting. Avery Holt joined by video, his expression grave but steady. No one asked Naomi if she was sure. That question had already been answered. Marisol slid the final documents across the table. Divorce petition, emergency asset protection orders, motions for forensic accounting. Each page represented a door quietly closing behind Ethan before he even realized he was moving. "This matters," Marisol said, tapping the top page. "By filing first, you control the narrative, not emotionally, legally. He reacts, you define." Naomi picked up the pen. For a brief moment, she thought of the woman she had been when she married Ethan. Thought of the optimism, the trust, the assumption that love and intelligence were mutual reinforcements. That woman felt distant now, not erased but transformed. Naomi signed. The pen lifted. The ink dried. The trajectory of Ethan Wright's life shifted permanently. By noon, the filings were live. By early afternoon, the asset freezes triggered, quietly, efficiently, without drama. Accounts that Ethan assumed were untouchable flagged and paused. Transfers scheduled weeks in advance stalled mid-process, caught in legal suspension like insects in amber. Naomi returned to campus and taught her afternoon seminar as scheduled. Students debated case studies, unaware that their professor had just executed the most consequential strategic decision of her life. Naomi listened, responded, guided discussion, all while her phone remained face down on the desk beside her. She didn't need to look at it to know what was happening. The first call came at 3:47 p.m. She let it go to voicemail. The second came 2 minutes later, then another. Text followed, confusion first, then irritation, then something sharper. "What is this? Call me immediately. We agreed to handle this privately." Naomi read none of them. At 4:30 p.m., Marisol forwarded her something instead. Confirmation that Ethan had been served at his office. The timing was intentional. Public enough to unsettle him. Professional enough to avoid spectacle. Ethan's next voicemail was different. The charm was gone. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You think you're being clever, but you've just escalated something you don't understand. Call me back before this gets ugly." Naomi closed her office door and sat down, finally allowing herself to breathe deeply. The shaking didn't come. Neither did the tears she'd expected weeks earlier. What came instead was a profound stillness. She forwarded the voicemail to Marisol, then to Holt, then archived it. Evidence. By evening, the tone shifted again. "You're overreacting," Ethan said in another message, trying a different register. "We can fix this. You're letting other people poison your thinking." Naomi, he still believed influence worked both ways. When she arrived home that night, the house felt different. Not emptier, lighter, as if something corrosive had been removed from the air. Ethan hadn't returned yet. She packed an overnight bag calmly, deliberately, taking only what she needed. Before leaving, she stood in the bedroom for a moment, taking in the space she had once shared unquestioningly. This was not loss. This was extraction. As she closed the door behind her, Naomi understood the true power of filing first. It wasn't revenge. It was interruption. Ethan's pattern relied on preparation, on gradual erosion, on controlling the tempo until his target was too disoriented to resist. By acting first, Naomi had shattered that rhythm. He would spend the coming weeks reacting instead of directing. And for a man who believed control was synonymous with safety, that shift would be unbearable. Naomi drove into the evening traffic, the city unfolding ahead of her, already moving toward a future Ethan could no longer predict. The game he thought he was playing had ended. And this time, he was already behind. Ethan came home late. Naomi knew he would. Men like him always needed time after losing control. Time to rehearse a new version of reality, one where they were still the architect rather than the collapse. She was already there when he entered the house, seated at the dining table with a single lamp on, the rest of the room deliberately dim. He stopped. For a moment, the mask flickered back into place. The familiar posture, the careful neutrality, but the strain showed in the tightness of his jaw, the way his shoulders were held just a fraction too high. "So," he said finally, voice smooth but brittle, "you want to explain what the hell today was about?" Naomi didn't stand. She didn't gesture. She looked at him steadily, the way she had learned to look at people when she needed them to reveal themselves. "There's nothing to explain," she said calmly. "You already know." Ethan laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You blindsided me, froze accounts, filed without warning. That's not how adults handle conflict." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Neither is orchestrating financial harm and calling it incompatibility." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. His face changed then, not dramatically, no shouting, just a subtle rearrangement like a structure shedding an unnecessary facade. The warmth drained away, leaving something harder behind. "I protected myself," Naomi replied. Ethan stepped closer. The air between them tightened, charged with something Naomi recognized instantly. Not rage, but calculation recalibrating under pressure. "You violated my privacy," he said coldly. "You crossed a line." "Naomi, for years," she said evenly, "you documented women without their consent. You analyzed them. You profited from them. And now you're offended." His eyes flashed. "You're twisting this." "No," Naomi said. "I'm naming it." That was when the mask finally fell. "You think you're smarter than me," Ethan snapped, the words sharp, venomous. You think because you teach theories and sit on panels that you understand how the world actually works. His voice rose, not loud, but edged with contempt. I built something. I took risks. I won. And now you're trying to take it from me because you can't handle that you're replaceable. There it was, the truth, unfiltered. Naomi felt a strange calm settle over her. This was what the archive had been missing. The raw articulation of belief. I was never trying to replace you, she said quietly. I was trying to survive you. Ethan scoffed. You're overestimating your leverage. People like you don't win these fights. You're too concerned with being seen as reasonable, with being liked. He leaned in, lowering his voice. I'll make you look unstable. I'll frame this as ambition turning bitter. And people will believe me. They always do. Naomi stood then, not in anger, but with deliberate ease. That's where you're wrong, she said. They believed you before because no one had the full picture. She met his gaze without flinching. Now they do. For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed his face. You think this ends with paperwork? He said quietly. You think exposure is enough? I've destroyed stronger women than you. Naomi's voice didn't waver. No. You destroyed women who were isolated, who blamed themselves, who didn't compare notes. She stepped past him, picking up her bag from the chair. That pattern ends here. Ethan turns sharply. You'll regret this. Naomi paused at the doorway, looking back at the man she had once loved, now fully visible in the harsh light of consequence. Regret comes from not acting when you should, she said. I acted. She left him standing there, stripped of charm, stripped of narrative, stripped of the certainty that had protected him for so long. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. Naomi inhaled deeply, feeling something she hadn't felt since the call weeks earlier. Relief. Behind her, the door closed softly. Inside that house remained the man without the mask. And for the first time, he was alone with what he truly was. The first meeting did not look like justice. There were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Just four women sitting around a plain conference table in a borrowed office, each holding a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Naomi arrived last. Not intentionally, she simply needed a moment outside the building, breathing in the damp Seattle air, steadying herself before stepping into something she understood would change her forever. Inside were Lena, whom she had spoken to by phone, Rachel, a former consultant Ethan had dated briefly after his second divorce, and Megan, whose name Naomi recognized immediately from the archive. Megan looked younger than Naomi had expected. That somehow made it worse. They nodded at one another, polite, cautious, uncertain. Years of isolation had taught each of them the same lesson. Speak carefully or not at all. Naomi broke the silence. I want to be clear, she said evenly. This isn't a support group. It's not therapy, and it's not about reliving what happened unless you choose to. They all looked up. This is about accuracy. That word, so precise, so unemotional, did something the others hadn't expected. Shoulders eased, postures shifted. Accuracy felt safer than vulnerability. Lena spoke first. He used to tell me I was bad with money, she said quietly. Not stupid, just careless, emotional. He said he'd help me manage things so we'd be secure. Rachel inhaled sharply. He said the same thing to me, that I was brilliant but impulsive, that he balanced me. Megan stared at the table. He told me I was special because I didn't need him, that I was different from the others. Naomi nodded once. He said that to all of you, she said. Megan looked up, her eyes glassy. I knew it. I knew it. But every time I tried to explain it to someone, I sounded insane. That's not an accident, Naomi replied. It's a feature. They began laying documents on the table. Not dramatically, methodically. Screenshots, emails, financial statements, timeline printouts. Each woman contributed pieces that had never made sense on their own. Together, they locked into place. Ethan's language repeated across relationships. His pacing, his escalation points, The way affection intensified right before conflict. The way doubt was introduced gradually, never all at once. Rachel laughed, suddenly, the sound brittle. He used to say, "I don't want to argue. I just want us to be rational." Naomi felt a chill. That phrase appears verbatim in 3 recorded conversations, she said. Silence fell. Not shocked, silence. Recognition. Megan covered her mouth. "So it wasn't me," she whispered. "I didn't imagine it." No. The room changed then, not with anger, but with alignment. Naomi watched it happen, the subtle shift from self-blame to shared clarity. This was the moment Ethan had worked hardest to prevent. The moment women stopped viewing their experiences as personal failures and began recognizing them as data points in a larger system. Gaslighting collapsed under comparison. "What do we do now?" Megan asked. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked around the table at the women who had been reduced, dismissed, financially scarred, and psychologically bruised, yet were still here. "Now," she said, "we stop speaking in isolation." They discussed next steps with the same seriousness they had given to recounting the past. Legal coordination, affidavits, corroboration, what to share publicly and what to reserve for court. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. At the end of the meeting, as they gathered their papers, Lena hesitated. "I spent years thinking I was weak," she said quietly, "that if I'd just been smarter or colder or less trusting." Naomi met her eyes. "Trust wasn't the flaw," she said. "It was the thing he exploited." Megan wiped her face, nodding. "He made us think surviving meant staying quiet." Naomi closed her folder. "Surviving meant staying alive. This," she gestured around the room, "is what living looks like." As they left the building together, the rain had stopped. The street reflected the city lights, sharp and bright, like something newly washed. Ethan had always relied on separation, on women never realizing they were part of a pattern. He had built his power on silence. It unraveled the moment they compared notes. And once that happened, there was no version of the story where he remained untouchable. Ethan had modeled risk the way he modeled everything else, through controlled variables and predictable reactions. He calculated exposure. He anticipated resistance. He built contingencies for loss. What he never modeled was collective truth. The first consequence arrived quietly, disguised as routine inconvenience. A scheduled transfer stalled. A partner delayed signing. A compliance officer requested clarification on a transaction Ethan had executed dozens of times before, without scrutiny. He dismissed it as noise. Then the noise began to synchronize. A venture firm requested a full audit as a precaution. A board postponed a vote, citing reputational concerns. A journalist reached out, not accusatory, just curious, asking about patterns in his personal and professional history. Ethan's confidence fractured in increments, not with panic, but irritation. He had always believed the world rewarded composure. That authority, once established, protected itself. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly authority dissolved when women stopped speaking alone. Behind the scenes, the machinery moved faster than he expected. Affidavits aligned, financial discrepancies corroborated, behavioral patterns, once dismissed as anecdotal, were suddenly contextualized across years and jurisdictions. Marisol Vega called Naomi late one evening. "They're taking this seriously," she said, "not because of volume, because of consistency." The filings expanded. Civil claims intersected with regulatory reviews. The word intent appeared repeatedly in language that no longer belonged to Naomi alone. Ethan responded, as he always had, by reframing. He released a statement emphasizing personal turmoil, misunderstandings, a painful divorce. He positioned himself as a private man caught in a public storm, careful to never deny specifics, only to abstract them. It might have worked once, but this time the narrative refused to fracture. Rachel's documentation matched Lena's. Megan's timelines reinforced Naomi's. Separate lives, identical structures. Independent verification stripped away the illusion of coincidence. The story stopped being about a man accused by one woman. It became about a system exposed by many. Investors withdrew not out of morality, but liability. Institutions distanced themselves not out of outrage, but risk management. Ethan watched relationships he had cultivated for decades evaporate with polite emails and closed doors. What shocked him most was the speed. Collapse, he learned too late, accelerated when no one rushed to defend you. The final blow came not from the court, but from the market. A longtime partner terminated their agreement, citing irreconcilable governance concerns. The phrasing was sterile, the implication devastating. Ethan's leverage vanished. Behind closed doors, he raged. He blamed Naomi. He blamed the women. He blamed the culture. But every argument returned to the same dead end. Too many corroborating truths. His lawyers shifted strategies from denial to mitigation, from confidence to containment. Naomi watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, with clarity. This was not revenge unfolding. It was consequence. Ethan had always believed that intelligence insulated him from accountability, that complexity favored those who understood it. What he had never modeled was the effect of transparency applied at scale. Patterns, once visible, did not require interpretation. They spoke for themselves. The final report arrived on a gray morning, its language precise, its conclusions restrained. No dramatics, no moral judgment, just findings, just causality. Ethan Wright's career did not end with a verdict. It ended with credibility loss. And in systems built on trust, credibility was the only currency that mattered. Naomi closed the file and set it aside. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only the quiet recognition that some people are undone not by force, but by the exposure of who they have always been. Ethan had never modeled for this outcome, because he had never imagined a world where women compared notes, institutions listened, and truth, unamplified, unembellished, was enough. But the world had changed, and it had done so without asking his permission. Survival did not arrive as a single triumphant moment. It came quietly, in increments Naomi barely noticed at first. In the weeks after everything settled, after the filings, the reports, the institutional distancing, her life did not suddenly become lighter. It became clearer, and clarity, she learned, was a different kind of freedom. Naomi moved into a smaller apartment overlooking a stretch of water where ferries passed at predictable intervals. She liked that. Predictability without manipulation. Choice without pressure. The space reflected her alone. No compromises disguised as partnership. No negotiations framed as love. She slept through the night for the first time in months. The absence of vigilance was startling. No scanning for tone shifts. No decoding subtext. No mental accounting of what might be used against her later. Peace, she discovered, was not loud. It did not announce itself. It simply stayed. Professionally, something unexpected happened. People listened to her differently, not with pity, with respect sharpened by recognition. Her research on power dynamics, coercion, and trust, once considered theoretical, was suddenly cited with urgency. Organizations sought her not for abstract insight, but for lived clarity. For someone who understood how manipulation actually worked, not just how it was described. Naomi accepted only the work that aligned. She began collaborating with legal advocates, financial educators, and therapists, helping translate patterns into language others could recognize before damage took root. She never positioned herself as a victim. She positioned herself as a witness. And witnesses, she learned, changed outcomes. The women stayed in contact, not constantly, not desperately, but steadily. A message here, a call there. Shared updates that marked progress rather than pain. They didn't need to revisit the past to remain connected. The past had already done its work. One evening, as Naomi watched the city lights ripple across the water, she realized something that surprised her. She was no longer angry. Anger had been fuel, necessary, but temporary. What remained was discernment. She had learned that forgiveness was not required for healing, that closure was not something another person could grant, and that walking away intact was sometimes the most radical outcome of all. Naomi picked up her phone and opened a new document. Not notes, not evidence, just a single sentence she would later share with audiences who needed to hear it. Strength isn't staying. Strength is knowing when to leave and how. If this story stayed with you, if you recognize pieces of yourself in Naomi or in the women who compared notes and changed the outcome, don't let it end here. Like this video so it reaches others who might still be questioning their reality. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. And follow the channel for more stories about truth, power, and the quiet courage it takes to choose yourself. Because survival is only the beginning. What comes after, that's where real life starts.